This episode of New Politics was released on the 8th of February, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Hello to you, David. It takes us a while to get used to this routine each year, but I hope you survived our first week back in this magnificent year in federal politics.
Already seems like a year, doesn't it? So much has happened and so much of it has been less positive than perhaps we might have expected. But we are where we are.
And we will be looking at quite a few things today. Some of the big issues in the first week back for federal parliament. Our audience has also asked us to look at the goings-on at the ABC with their 361% support of Peter Dutton. And just on the ABC, it's in a little bit of trouble with an unlawful sacking of one of its employees, and that's because she posted a finding from Human Rights Watch on social media, and we'll be getting onto those issues soon. And David will be doing our best to make sense of what's happening in this bizarre world of politics.
It's going to be a journey. Before we go on, I'd just also like to mention that I have it on good authority that we've got fans within the radiation therapy department at Royal North Shore Hospital. So I'd just like to say hello to them and keep up the good work.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
Parliament has returned for 2025 and as usual there's a lot going on. The government has decided to shelve the Environment Protection Agency. That's all official now. Nothing will happen with this until after the next election and probably never will. Gambling advertising legislation is also off the table and that won't be happening until after the next election and again probably will never happen either. And this one is a strange one because the proposed legislation was going to be tapered in over 3 years anyway, and that would have been more than enough time for the gambling industry to get its act together to cater for this, but it was not to be. And there are other announcements. The government has announced $1.7 billion for hospital funding, and to me that suggests that the government wants to run Medicare and healthcare as an issue at the next federal election. They've also presented a bill to introduce a 3-day guarantee for subsidised early education and childcare. That's another announcement too. Some of these are old measures that were previously announced, but now they're getting re-announced again and again, and I think that we'll probably see more of this over the next few months. There'll be old announcements, new announcements, old, new, borrowed and blue, and everything in between.
Supporters of the government can point genuinely to achievements and wins, if you like, for the government over the last 3 years. So it's odd that they're trying this Morrison-esque tactic of announcing without actually following through with announcements. The government has a lot of advantages to it. Again, we've got to take out the support for the genocide, but the economy is better. There's still issues with the economy, but all indications are pointing to up. Jobs are up. The government has had successes in foreign policy outside the Middle East and AUKUS. The government has built a decent legacy. Now, it's probably not quite enough of a legacy to give its wavering supporters a ringing endorsement, but it's enough that I don't know that they have to rely on further announcements and bizarre announcements, like scrapping the EPA. Why are they doing this? What's the argument? Why is the Western Australian Labor Party so influential all of a sudden? I know that they won extremely big in the last election, but you'd think that something that is going to turn off your inner city types. Now, there's very little risk that those seats that are in a city that are Labor will go to Liberal, but there's strong independence and there's the Greens. I'm wondering if there's a strategy to rely on preferences, knowing that those that are angry with the government are still going to preference them even second last.
And that might be a strong possibility, but I think generally this is a very strange time for Parliament. And maybe it's because, well, we've just had a break and then the election is due in May. And that's what it's been like in 2019 and 2022. And it is just over 3 months before the federal election has to be held in May this year. And it's very similar to those final periods of the Morrison government in those years that I mentioned, 2019 and 22. And there's just not much to do. The government doesn't seem to have much of an intention of doing very much either. And this essentially means that we've had 2.5 years of government. And David, you did mention that they've done actually quite a lot of things in those first 2.5 years. And I think it's probably another argument for why we should have fixed 4-year terms, because we've just been sneezing a little bit and this term is almost over. And the Australian Greens have also said that they would try and work out another way of implementing that gambling advertising legislation, but it's not clear how that's going to happen, because it's pretty obvious that the Labor government doesn't want to have anything to do at all with this gambling advertising legislation. But there is a lot of leftover stuff. Gambling, the EPA, and why you would take it this far and then cancel it is, to me, it's a very strange decision. There's also the truth in advertising legislation. That's in draft form, so it's not going to come in at all during this term. And just going back to the proposed EPA, which is now being canned, that was canned at the behest of the WA government, even though there's virtually no chance that Labor will lose their upcoming state election on March the 8th. And the Liberal Party, according to internal research, is not seeing those expected gains that they might have been expecting. So I think generally we can just see that any form of complaint from anyone, whether it's from the WA Labor government or from the gambling industry or the Israel lobby or whoever it is, any dissent from anyone and critically needed legislation just gets canned. And I think that that's a terrible way to run government. And albeit those issues that you mentioned before, David, that there is quite a lot of legislation that the government has implemented, but I think you have to, for these signature sort of policies, you do have to have the courage of your convictions. And in the case of the EPA, well, they could have spoken to the WA government about some of these issues months ago or even years ago. They knew that the state election was always going to be held on March the 8th, 2025, and it might also be because of potential federal seat losses that they're worried about. But either way, I don't think it's a good look, and I don't think that it's good enough.
I've said this before, I think. Labor has a crisis of confidence. It's the exact opposite to the problem with the Liberal Party, in that Labor has a fairly good cabinet. I saw a comment today just on social media.
Well, we have to believe it if it's on social media.
But it said the Albanese government has been the least scandal-prone government since Federation. We haven't had a lot of ministerial resignations through improper behaviour. We haven't had a lot of questionable beings in positions of power. And there hasn't been a lot. I can't think of any minister who's resigned through a scandal. And in fact, I can't even think of any.
Well, there were those ministers that were demoted for their work in the immigration portfolios and home affairs.
Yep.
But that wasn't through scandals, that was through a bit of incompetence, I think.
Yeah. They weren't taking bribes or they weren't using their positions improperly. Like in New South Wales, we've just lost the Transport Minister who was thought to have misused her car allowance to take long trips in Commonwealth cars. I don't think Anthony Albanese's had to deal with that. And I think most ministers, and there's always a few exceptions, and there's always going to be a few exceptions because of the breadth of the federal government, but most ministers are at least competent. We may not have a lot of brilliant ministers, although there are a couple there too. I suppose Mark Dreyfus has skirted controversy with his various views and his unpopularity. And yeah, we might be heading towards, there's been some question that he's taken a gift and then not declared it. I must also underline here that not liking a person's position doesn't necessarily mean they're corrupt. But even so, if Mark Dreyfus steps down because of these allegations turn out to be at least credible, it's still a fairly clean government from that point of view. So Labor's main cause of disaffection is in its messaging, really, and its inept messaging. It doesn't know how to win the political battles, and I think that goes back to a crisis of confidence.
And David, as you know, there's no such thing as a free lunch, but the Liberal Party wants to give business a free lunch, or at least a deduction for business lunches. And this is like 1985 all over again, because before then, businesses could make a tax deduction just for having lunch, before Paul Keating as Treasurer cut this malarkey out. And this to me just seems like a stupid policy. No one is asking for this. No one in the business community has said to Peter Dutton, look, give us a free lunch policy. We desperately need that. And there might be some benefits for cafes, restaurants and the service industry. And there have been some suggestions that pole dancing, strip clubs and going off to play golf would be permitted tax deductions as well. And with some creative accounting, I'd imagine that there'd be a lot more things that would end up being tax deductible. So with this Liberal Party policy, there's no real benefit except for business owners and corporations and maybe some strip clubs in King's Cross. But one thing I think that it does show is that the Liberal Party and the National Party are starting to get a little bit complacent about the next election, and they are starting to get into overreach, and they might actually be starting to measure up the curtains in government offices without doing the hard work of actually trying to run and win an election campaign. And this has opened them up to all sorts of ridicule. Here's the Treasurer Jim Chalmers in Parliament during the week.
This is the only kind of policy that could have been agreed at the tail end of a very long lunch, Mr Speaker. You can imagine them sitting around with the blue teeth and the soy sauce on the tie, coming up with the big ideas, Mr Speaker, and either they didn't know how much it cost when they announced the policy or they didn't want Australians to know. They have refused to come clean on the costs of their long lunch policy or what they will cut to pay for that policy. And there's a pattern here. On Sunday, the Leader of the Opposition was asked about whether there'd be cuts in the budget. He said there would be, but he wouldn't tell the Australian people until after the election.
And this has provided just an easy opportunity for the government, and I think it also signals what the priorities are for the coalition. And for the government, well, they can just always navigate towards that idea of how on earth can this help workers with cost of living pressures, and that's exactly what they ended up doing during the week.
I mean, I suppose Peter Dutton could point to, well, it's open to anyone. So all the cleaning staff going out for a long boozy lunch rather than cleaning, or even fairer, rather than sleeping till they get ready for their next shift. The brickies and the plumbers and chippies on a tight deadline. It's 12 o'clock. Let's rip off to Doyle's in Double Bay, have a nice seafood lunch for 3 hours, and we'll talk business. It's not going to happen. Should it happen? Yeah, I'm more than happy for people to eat well and eat nicely. But it's tax cuts or tax advantages aimed at a particular class who have the luxury of being able to take those breaks. And there may be some benefit to restaurant owners and cafe owners and other such places, but I don't think there is, because the people who use the lunchtime meal for business can still tax deduct it as a legitimate business expense. Those that don't probably aren't as big a percentage of the population as he's calculated. And so it's really just nailing his colours to the wall as who the Dutton economy is going to favour. And that's going to be a problem. I still am of the belief, and this is based on my own travels and speaking to a wide variety of voters, of if you were to do one of those word clouds which bring up words that describe someone, the biggest word would be dickhead when it came to Peter Dutton, because that's how I continually hear him being described. Maybe, and this is a big call, but maybe even more than Scott Morrison. And again, I don't want to say that Anthony Albanese is the most popular Prime Minister we've ever had and is deeply beloved, and if he's not deeply beloved, he should be deeply beloved. But a competent opposition should have been able to really exploit this stuff without the help of a soft media, without the help of soft commenters making up foibles and characteristics of Dutton that are clearly not the case. We're living in the worst timeline.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis. the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
The ABC is increasingly becoming obsessed with the leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, and it just seems to be never ending, with not only prefacing a lot of its political reporting with Peter Dutton says, but now inviting government ministers onto the ABC and asking them to comment on Liberal Party announcements. Here's Patricia Cavallis inviting the Government Finance Minister Katy Gallagher onto the afternoon briefing.
And let's go straight to the Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, ahead of a very big sitting fortnight. Minister, lovely to have you in the studio.
Yeah, lovely to be here, thanks.
So on Friday, the opposition leader delivered a big speech that pertains very much to your portfolio.
And we receive a lot of complaints about how the ABC News will frequently cut a media conference given by the Prime Minister to then go on to some irrelevant story or break into a weather report, or like in this following case that we're just about to provide, journalists will ask the Prime Minister about the opposition, then cut while the question is still being asked, and then go straight to Peter Dutton, which in this case was not even a media conference.
Forget about the opposition. I've been talking about the need to protect places of worship very clearly. I've made the government's position on that very clear.
And that is the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. We're going to continue monitoring that press conference for any news out of that and bring you that straight away. We do want to take you, though, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has also spoken this morning.
It's going to be a busy year, every election year is, but I thought this morning was a very nice start to the parliamentary year, as it always is, in a bipartisan way. So that's a nice thing.
Are you ready to lead the country?
So that's the state of ABC journalism at the moment. And back to afternoon briefing. This is being repositioned as the ABC's leading political news program. But in its first episode for this year, Peter Dutton was mentioned 46 times, or almost once a minute, whereas Anthony Albanese is mentioned just 11 times. So there's a 361% difference there. Here's a cut-up of that program, courtesy of the Noisy Elephant, who also produced this analysis.
Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Peter Dutton, opposition leader Peter Dutton, clearly Peter Dutton, Peter Dutton's. Okay, but Peter Dutton, today, Peter Dutton. Very quickly on another issue, Peter Dutton. But Australians are being told by Peter Dutton, and therefore this is Peter Dutton's election to lose. Peter Dutton. Later today in Perth, Peter Dutton, opposition leader Peter Dutton's opposition leader Peter Dutton. He also suggested, let's take a listen.
Now, positions have been added.
The opposition leader has slammed the government over budget forecasts.
And I think this just highlights how low the ABC has fallen in its editorial standards and is just filled with pro-Liberal Party hacks, both within the newsrooms and within management. There's leading questions about, are you ready to lead the country? As though it's a fait accompli. There's amplification of everything to do with Peter Dutton, and this guy's just being forced down our throats. Now, name recognition is everything in politics, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that will translate into votes. But I just think that this is highly unprofessional behaviour by the ABC. It's been taken over by Liberal Party hacks from News Corporation. They're pumping up Peter Dutton's tyres at every opportunity. They're avoiding any scrutiny of this guy, and I think that's the most important issue, even though he's in the running to become Prime Minister, and they're not even hiding it anymore. And this is not going to change before the next election, but I think it's also another missed opportunity by the Prime Minister to reform the ABC back into a quality and balanced public broadcaster.
And that's the point, isn't it? I don't want them to sing the Anthony Albanese song, Anthony is the sun in the sky and the moon doesn't rise without Anthony. I don't want any of that, of course. I want fair. When they do something right, report that. When they do something wrong, report that. And same with the opposition. The opposition has to have something worthwhile to say. That's always been the rule. Oppositions have always found it hard. Till the last 10 years, oppositions have found it, or 20 years, have always found it hard to get people to press conferences. The Prime Minister would see the opposition was holding one, then call something and announce something just to take oxygen away and what have you. And opposition leaders found it very frustrating that they found it that little bit harder to get. And now it's gone the other way, where the government is struggling to get air time. One, we need a total clean out of the ABC. It's not that X reporter votes Liberal or Labor or Green or what have you. It's the bias. You can still be critical of your party. You can still present. And Kerry O'Brien, who would grill everybody despite being an obvious Labor supporter. Paul Keating didn't get any of an easier time than, say, John Howard did under Kerry O'Brien, even though he was fairly open about where his political allegiances lay. Laura Tingle. Now, I don't know where Laura Tingle's political allegiances lay, I could guess, but she is just as hard on Liberal issues, Labor, and Nationals issues, Greens, etc., etc. Now, I think the Labor Party made a mistake in appointing Kim Williams as chair. I was very sceptical at first. I was assured by a lot of people, no. He did work for Murdoch, but he's not a Murdoch hack. Okay, well, we give him a go. And he's probably not a Murdoch hack, but some of the choices that he's made have been strange, to say the least. For example, axing the drum and putting on cooking show. And wasn't it repeats of Hard Quiz too? A show that I must admit is lost on me. But
well, maybe you can take the boy out of the Murdoch, but you can't take the Murdoch out of the boy.
Maybe that's the case. You'd want somebody with public broadcasting experience. You see it all the time in not-for-profits. The board gets the idea, we'll get in business people, and then the next thing, the not-for-profit is in a lot of trouble, because they might be great business people, but the philosophy is different, and the techniques that work in a privatized company or a private company don't work for a not-for-profit. The things that work for commercial television don't work for a public broadcaster. The ABC should be a station in which at some point in the year, every Australian gets something that they might be interested in. It shouldn't be about ratings to an extent. You want some people, you don't want a national show where only 300 people watch and it's prime time, for example. But you do want shows of interest, and a show that you and I might not be interested in, maybe of keen interest to somebody in a different demographic.
And I think that's a bit of a vexed question, because what the ABC has traditionally done very well is news coverage, reporting and current affairs, but it just doesn't do that very well anymore, and there's just not enough of it. And I think that most of its journalists are compromised, and many of them have cut their teeth at News Corporation. It's like this dumbed down sensationalism for the sake of sensationalism. It's not a balanced perspective, and it's skewing towards a conservative side of politics, and sometimes its analysis is just incorrect. So if this is the case, and if it's got no intention of correcting any of this, and if the government, a Labor government which you'd normally consider to be a friend of the ABC, and it's just given it extra funding with no strings attached, well, what is the point of it in its current format? And there are people who will criticise us and say, well, that's just going to be a government-controlled propaganda machine if you get the government to come in and reform it. Well, that's where we are with the ABC at the moment. It's a result of the coalition interference over the past 29 years, with the interference from the coalition and from News Corporation. And for the Labor government now to literally just have a hands-off approach and leave the ABC in its current mess, well, to me, that's a dereliction of duty, and it's almost like an insult to public broadcasting. Well, first of all, you fix it up, and then you set it up with strong legislation so it can't be tampered with in the future, and then you can walk away from it. You know, get Michelle Rowlands to sort it out, the communications minister, or install a maverick minister who has got some idea about broadcasting media and can see the potential of the ABC in the digital age, and get them to do the work. And, you know, young people just don't watch the ABC anymore. We've got 21-year-olds in our respective families, and if you ask them about the ABC, Well, I give you a bemused look and say, well, what ABC, that's for old people, isn't it? Why would I watch that? And these are the sorts of people that the ABC does need to engage with if it wants to survive. And I don't mean through free-to-air television or radio, because that's essentially almost dead, but engage this 20 to 35-year-old demographic through different media, producing engaging and meaningful content. But it's this legacy top-down type of media that needs to be reinvented, and I just don't think the ABC is currently equipped to reinvent itself in this way.
I had actually high hopes for Ita Buttrose, which were pretty dashed, and that's why I felt very sceptical of Kim Williams. The model, I think, the best television news is SBS, where they generally give a very balanced, competent, literate, articulate, well-presented news broadcast. And I know that there are a lot of people swapping from the 7 o'clock broadcast on the ABC to the 6:30 on the SBS, or at least streaming all this stuff. SBS also is a little bit less parochial, shall we say, in that it does show international news. It's not just from mostly America, a lot of Britain and a tiny bit of the Middle East, but only as it affects Western stuff, and then a bit of Western Europe if something they deem interesting is happening. The other thing that does give me promise for the ABC is a show focused on the Pacific Islands, and there was a great story on Samoa and a great story on Tonga and various Fiji and the various issues that they were facing at the time. And I thought if we could have more of that, maybe a show on a Friday night that focused on each state for that state. Don't know if that's been tried.
Well, the good news is, David, that people are always looking to us for solutions, and we've always got a lot of good ideas to put out there. And it's always a question of how things could be different. And you've mentioned SBS. For me, I like to look in different fields as well. But 6 News in Melbourne is a good example. And it's not the only example, but it's a good example. It's run by teenagers. It's low cost. It's engaging. It looks professional. There's also podcasting from the independent sphere. There's a lot of good podcasts out there that could be branded under the banner of the ABC, low-cost material. It's stuff that's a little bit more radical and coming from the voice of community. And some legacy media is already starting to do this overseas, where old media like the New York Times and CNN, well, they're starting to mimic new media production by producing and releasing podcasts and vodcasts that are a little bit more conversational, they're more informal, and it ends up being a two-way process rather than that one-way approach of legacy media. You know, that process of, oh, well, here's the news, believe me, because I'm the newsreader. It's all very scripted and very authoritative and very authoritarian, and people generally have moved away from that model. And I think the New York Times have recognised that they need to adapt or else they will die. And what have we got at the ABC? You mentioned Kim Williams quite a few times today, but we've got Kim Williams as the chair of the ABC. And when he was asked about Joe Rogan, he instantly dismissed it. And instead of thinking, well, why is this guy the most popular podcast in the United States? Why is this guy the most popular podcast in Australia? Now, you don't have to like him or the content that he puts out, and I certainly don't. But
the numbers are the numbers, though.
Well, that's right. But a clever media executive would look at the things that are being successful and start adopting or adapting some of those tactics. And if it's not someone like Joe Rogan, well, you look at someone like Friendly Geordies in Australia. And again, Jordan Shanks isn't everyone cups of tea, but you just find out what works and then you work towards that.
You don't want the toxic masculinity of Joe Rogan, and you don't want the sort of wide-eyed curiosity that allows everything in. But Rogan has a curiosity that I think appeals to people. Jordan Shanks does extremely good work in investigative journalism. His house was burned down because of it. You know that you're making a difference.
Oh, well, I think there's all these people out there that are making a difference, like Leo Puglisi in 6 News in Melbourne. That's
incredible
making a difference
work
as well. It's far more professional than a lot of things that you'll see on the ABC News at the moment.
And people, I've seen a comment to Leo that was along the lines of, I saw this on the mainstream news, but till you guys did it, I wasn't prepared to believe it. And they often break stories before. I think there's a risk there. A lot of stories do have to go through the legal process, which I don't know that 6 News has. But to be fair, they often get a lot of exclusives. He works around his exams and his school timetable, but it's great stuff, and I'm hoping it's the future of Australian journalism.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
Took a walk to the cement at night, you and I, to bring home in the old crib with the familiar, you and I. And the door was opening wide, do or die. And their mouths grew familiar, who we are.
And still with the ABC, there's an unfair dismissal case running in Sydney, which is tying in quite a few different elements of politics into the one issue. And that's the Lattouf versus ABC case, where the journalist Antoinette Lattouf is accusing the ABC of an unlawful termination when they sacked her over social media reposts that she made last year, which included a Human Rights Watch post saying that the Israeli government was using starvation as a method of warfare in Gaza. And she also added the words HRW reporting starvation as a tool of war. Now, there's no other words there. It's not emotional. It's just simply providing a fact as far as I can see. And Human Rights Watch is not some ragtag, radicalised movement designed to cause trouble. It's a reputable organisation consisting of about 550 people from 70 different nationalities who are experts in geopolitics, but it also includes a range of lawyers, journalists and investigators. And it also has an office in Sydney, and it was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for its work on banning landmines all around the world. So for a journalist to repost material from Human Rights Watch and be sacked for doing this by ABC management just because the Israel lobby and the Zionists in Sydney wanted her to be sacked, I think that this is just an over-the-top abuse of power. Now, there's quite a few issues here. There's the unlawful termination, there's the lack of support for a journalist doing their work, there's the lack of backbone from the ABC management, and there's the undue influence of the Israel lobby over the media in Australia. Now, all of this would have just blown away if the ABC just had some courage last year, stood up to these Zionist bullies and just let Lattouf finish her 5-day shift. And if that happened, well, we would not be here discussing this today, David.
Yeah, it's the Streisand effect. People realise that Antoinette Lattouf is actually a pretty good journalist. She may not have been quite as well known, and I believe she pointed out that all kinds of ABC personalities retweet stories from the ABC without then having to find a story that, quote, balances that story. She pointed to Annabelle Crabb, Lee Sales, Craig Roycastle, and she's absolutely right. I don't see how you get sacked by saying, here's an article from my employer that I quite enjoyed, everyone have a read of it. That's usually encouraged behaviour. Was she the one too where the lawyer admitted on a leaked WhatsApp that they gave misleading legal advice, which was a bit naughty, which of course would get you disbarred under normal circumstances? It was a very serious thing to have done. So her case is pretty strong. The other thing I did find funny is that they said, oh, it can't be racist because we saw her as being Lebanese, that she was white. And I think her response was along the lines of, I wish you'd told me that in school. I'd have had a much easier time of things.
Well, there was quite a lot of eye-rolling going on when that was announced in the court. But I think, once again, it's just showing the terrible actions of the Israel lobby in Australia. And we've been going on about this over the past year or so. And its power and influence throughout Australian society is just, it really is over the top, and everyone in positions of power is just cowered by them, and that's media and politics and the judiciary and quite a few other areas as well. And it is a case where a lot of these influential people within this lobby group can just ring up the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald or the managing director or the chair of the ABC board and demand that someone be sacked, and then that usually happens. And if they could just let things go and just let things pass, well, a lot of this stuff would not be an issue. And acting in this way, I think we discussed this last week, it's actually bad for the Jewish community in Australia because it's only it's a very, very small component of the Jewish community, but it's an influential minority that always gets engaged in this action. As you rightly pointed out, David, it's like the Streisand effect, but, multiplied by about 10. That Kafaya issue at the Sydney Theatre Company in 2023. We don't like the look of the Kafaya. We've decided that it's offensive to us. We're going to make a big fuss about this, withdraw all the funding to the Sydney Theatre Company. And that became big news over the next 6 months. And if they just had let it go, it would not have been an issue. And Antoinette Lattouf, they couldn't even wait for her to finish her 5-day shift. She had to be removed immediately. And because of this action, the reputation of the ABC has been diminished dramatically, in my opinion. And they've also had to fork out $4 million for legal costs in this unlawful termination case. And it's a little bit like the secret police force. This is fascist behaviour. Like any slight, whether it's perceived or real, is reported, and people who are just doing their job get intimidated and then they get sacked.
Yeah, it shows a level of desperation. People who have a valid argument don't need to go to this. Now, the other thing we've got to is the scourge of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. I condemn, as I know you do too, Eddie, anti-Semitism. I condemn people being vilified for their background, for their religious beliefs. I condemn people who think that you shouldn't hold political beliefs. However, you are allowed to disagree with people. The difference between a political idea, such as, say, environmental policy, where there's a lot of high passion on both sides, and we need these debates. I've taken something relatively neutral. The ability to be able to criticise governments, not because of their genetic makeup or their cultural background, but because of their policy. No government in the world is perfect. Some are less imperfect than others. But without the ability to criticise this type of thing, democracy gets undermined. Look at the States. Look what's happening there. We're watching the United States collapse in real time. Can it be fixed? I hope so, but do I think it can be? I'm not sure. For such a small group of a small group to try and stop debate that they don't like, instead of having the debate. And yeah, the Kafaya, the Sydney Theatre Company holds 250 people maybe in a city of 6 million, in a country of 26 million. And one person says, I felt uncomfortable. I mean, we could prod, why did you feel uncomfortable? Could that be guilt rather than fear? And I don't want to say that people don't feel what they feel, but some things seem to be over-exaggerated.
And these are important points, I think. And just by us, we're discussing this process today, and we'll be accused of being anti-Semitic just for bringing up these contradictions in what's being proposed here. And there has been a history of all of this stuff as well. Mike Carlton was suspended for a column that he wrote about Gaza for the Sydney Morning Herald in 2014, and he was actually mainly suspended for some of the comments that he made to readers who criticised him over the article. The cartoonist Glenn Lelivre, he has never been employed again by the Sydney Morning Herald for a cartoon depicting an Israeli man sitting in a couch with a TV remote control looking over the bombing of Gaza, even though that was a reflection of Israelis doing exactly the same thing from the hills overlooking Gaza at that time, back in 2014, even going to the process of setting up a coin-operated telescope so that they could have a closer look at the death and destruction. So all of this sort of stuff of journalists being sacked or other people being sacked for having particular political views, even though they might have views that are totally unrelated to the work that they're doing, like this has been going on for far too long. So it is happening frequently in the Australian media, and to take it to this next level of ridiculousness, the cricket commentator Peter Laylaw, he was sacked by Sen Radio because he posted material about Gaza on his Twitter account. And the Israel lobby let Sen Radio know and then said that the voice of Peter Laylaw was distressing and triggering to them. Now, there were no questions asked about this. Like Sen Radio didn't ask, well, who's being triggered by the voice of Peter Laylaw? How many people and why are they being triggered by the voice of Peter Laylaw? And people just end up being sacked. A cricket commentator sacked because he posted information in support of the people of Gaza on social media. Now, there's no correlation between that and cricket commentary. You know, Peter Laylaw didn't mention Gaza at all during any of his cricket commentary, and I didn't even know that he had posted any of this information, but thanks to the efforts of the Israel lobby, well, more people now know about it, and more people will get to understand the ridiculous overreach of this incredibly small group of extreme right-wing people, where they can just pick up the phone, sideline people who they disagree with. And overall, this is at odds with a modern, pluralistic Australian society where it shouldn't be up to one group that can dictate these sorts of terms anywhere, even to the point where people are sacked unlawfully and then having to foot the bill for being sacked unlawfully.
And again, if you say, like, we're in a different position in that we can say things that will upset people with different views to us. If you say things that are genuinely threatening to a person's feeling of safety, you know, and as much as I will run down people I disagree with intellectually, I don't wish them ill will. I don't wish them harm. I don't think Peter Dutton should be hurt in any way. I just wish he wasn't in politics or would change his opinion.
Well, we're not going to ring up the Liberal Party and demand that Peter Dutton be sacked. That's up to the Australian public to decide upon that.
And I know that Peter Dutton triggers a lot of our listeners out there and they turn the television off. And I'm sure, too, there are listeners out there who the voice of Anthony Albanese does the same thing. But again, you wouldn't do that. You hope your agitation in your actions and debate and might remove these figures from the influence they have, because that's the whole nature of politics, to do that. But I certainly don't feel that seeing Peter Dutton on the television, I'm going to be killed or I'm going to be beaten up or I'm going to feel unsafe walking down the street. I just wish he did something else other than politics. And that's where the perspective is lost, I think, by taking away the idea that a lot of what is really being argued over, should Israel be a state? Does Israel have a right to the Gaza Strip? Do the Palestinians have a right to stay in Gaza? All of these are ideas that have been warped to the point where there is a genocide going on. And there's been very little accountability for that. There's a different effect in Australia. Certainly there are people here who have family directly affected, and my heart goes out to them. And I hope that if you've got family in the Middle East, that they come through okay. And if they haven't come through okay, I'm profoundly sorry. But for a lot of the people making the comments here, it's much more of a theoretical argument than it is a practical real-world thing. And I think we've got to remember that for all the talk of that act of war at Kefir, well, 400 people were killed today in Gaza. Where's the perspective?
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it, level the site, and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job.
And I think it's also where we stand on a level of humanity as well, because we've just had Donald Trump meeting up with Benjamin Netanyahu, and both of those are criminals, and they're talking about raising Gaza and moving Palestinians out, which is the same as ethnic cleansing, and it's contributing to genocide. So I just don't think that it's possible for us, working in the media or anyone else, just to sit by and think, well, that's okay, we're just not going to talk about that. We're going to let that happen. We're going to let this genocide just proceed, this ethnic cleansing, which we thought as a concept ended many, many years ago. But here we are having the United States President and the Israel Prime Minister standing at a podium in New York and promoting these sort of concepts. And I just don't think that it's possible for us to sit by and let that happen.
You got to hold people to account. If you don't hold people to account, they get away with stuff. This is how Donald Trump gets to become president. He was never held to account. They didn't charge him with insurrection. They didn't follow through with the impeachments. They just let him get away with everything without consequence. And now they're paying for it. Eggs have gone up 300%, for example. Medicine has gone up some insane amount. You can't get small packages from China at the moment because people have started to buy straight from China because it's cheaper, even with the freight. And that's what happens. You've got to hold power to account. And until you do that, you get Trump, you get Dutton, you get Morrison, you get Bolsonaro, you get Putin, you get all these types of people who you don't want. You get Thatcher. Yeah, and until that happens, we're in a bad spot. And it may be too late in America. It's not too late here. It's time to hold everyone to account, not just those that we don't like.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.